Chapter 14. The Inconvenient Convenience. The first speaker stated, "Your report appears adamant." And came the reply of the second. "He's finished, I tell you." There was a pause before the first chose to speak again. "I may have to agree with you. Albeit on advisement. You will proceed." The second clearly felt vindicated. Yet was sensible enough to remain in control. He said, "I think we still have one minor problem to resolve." And then we proceed. The first might well have nodded before speaking. Good. Time is against us. But isn't it always? Even in an infinity of our own manufacture. I no longer doubted that Shadow had arrived here on an invisible pale horse, and that havoc and chaos had come riding in eagerly on his coattails. Yet, just before he nodded off on our sofa, his breathing worryingly ragged, I could only see a small severely wounded animal. He kept being injured. And after that bomb in that other place, I had a pretty good idea how it was happening. But Satan? Ahriman? He was real enough. Albeit self-declared by manifestation, and he was a player who'd mistakenly thought he was more than a match for Shadow, which wasn't what I saw. I saw a small injured cat put him in his place. And yet, despite the demonstration, I guessed that Satan, alleged Satan, even though he couldn't beat him, must have realized that my little friend was injured. And I didn't think he was going to leave it there unexploited. In other words, there would be more trouble on the way, and quite soon if he wished to press his advantage. I brought my hand to pat Shadow's head softly, for which I received short shrift and a comparatively pathetic scratch for my impertinence. "Forget being tough with me," I said, straightening up and licking my wound. "Like it or not, it's here that you come when you're injured. Not anywhere else." His gaze was even and his sharp little teeth were showing. His intent at intimidation was clear. "While you're in my house," I said, "you will respect my simple rules, otherwise pack your bag when you're better and bugger off." Ungrateful little bastard. I brought my financial cliff even closer, making sure he was all right. Shadow shut his mouth, dropped his head onto his front paws, and then gave me a look of patronizing assessment before shutting his eyes. I patted the galactic ass kicker on his head once again, just to affectionately irritate him more than anything else. I had enough smarts to pull my hand back quickly. Shadow slept for 3 days straight, allowing me to dress his wound once a day. He drank some milk, a worryingly small amount, and ate nothing throughout that period. For my part, I only potted around the place and kept popping back into the cottage, probably too often, to check how my vicious little mate was doing. I topped up or changed the milk and left some of my own tuna and sunflower oil in his bowl. Anyway, galactic warrior crisis aside. At long last, I attached the greenhouse roof on top of the side frames and the gable ends. And the whole glazed structure felt like a solid and hefty unit when I shook it. It probably needed bolting down, but it was strong enough and would do in the short term. I cleaned the glass and replaced 4 gaps with old and cloudy polycarbonate sheeting. And what was left of the wooden pallets and other lengths of wood about the place, I used to create shelving to hold plants on the north side away from the midday sun. Until extended warm weather arrived, plants waiting to go outside could rest there. I just potted. My whole day generally revolved around minor tasks to occupy and distract myself from Shadow's serious condition and concerns arising thereof. I received a phone call during that time from a former work colleague. He told me that my last employer had died suddenly. Maybe, he suggested tentatively, I'd care to come to the funeral to show my respects. I was curious that he'd called me of all people. The family must be short of mourners willing to turn up to show respect for the recently departed bastard. I advised the caller that I'd be happy to attend. But only if I could bring my banjo to practice. Broke as I was happy to go out and buy a banjo. The nasty little sod damaged so many lives with his greed and bullying. I knew that if I brought a banjo, others would bring a spade and a can of petrol to make sure the little bastard was gone. I allowed the stunned silence to extend for my own delight, and then signed off. I remembered the little bastard who would always fade into the shadows when it came time to pay for anything. So in the end, we never carried money when we went out on business. Who did I know had a banjo? When Shadow eventually rose from his sickbed, he was still very unwell and resented the vulnerability, and showed it. His condition obliged him to use the couple of box steps I'd created for him to get down off the sofa. I allowed him his dignity and looked away as he tried to stretch in excruciatingly painful silence. While I tidied up around the garden, Shadow ambled about stiffly within the house, and would lie across the threshold on a small rug I'd placed there for him. He took the antibiotics and painkillers the vet sold me at an extortionate price with little fuss. Except, he nearly took my nose off when I patronizingly told him he was a good boy. I didn't tell him that the treatment and drugs had cost me a few pennies over £200, and that the legal mechanical test for his primary mode of earthbound travel was at risk. I'd hoped that a judicious bit of mind-reading on his behalf might reveal that sacrifice and afford me a bit of respect. I allowed myself an ironic little laugh at that vain hope. I was back to gentle wine drinking and had put recent satanic experiences behind me. I couldn't imagine Satan turning up again if Shadow were up and about, let alone him touching my wine. And so we settled down, me and my glass, sat comfortably on the sofa speaking aloud my thoughts while the cat watched me closely. I could see him from the corner of my eye, and knew he was paying attention. But for all I knew, he was laughing. "Did the havoc arrive before you?" I asked, while pondering what his response might be. Maybe he was talking to me and perhaps he wasn't. I continued regardless. "While that recent kerfuffle on the railway was new to you, the kind of stuff wasn't. And that bloke who was here 4 days back, Satan, only he wasn't Satan. Not the real one anyway. I guess he probably changes his name to something scary wherever he goes. And I get the impression you've known each other for a long time." I checked the cat for a response and saw nothing on his face other than a vague bored interest. He might have looked different, but it was his face we both saw over the house when we were fighting off those monster chickens. I reckon that most of what's been going on has had something to do with him. And it seems to be very personal. I took a small sip of the wine. "It's also like he's been testing you to see how you react to threats against me. Probably working out how far you'll go before dumping me. Am I close?" I turned to him again. His head was on his paws and he was looking up at me very carefully, although giving nothing away. I went on. As far as I was concerned, I was only a passing entertainment in the middle of someone else's galactic game. I have 2 conclusions. 1. The island's an unlucky place all of a sudden. And 2. You're a fixer. How does that scan? His eyes didn't waver in their steady evaluation. The crackling wood on my right drew my attention back to the fire. It had overcome the dampness of the new wood and was well on its way to bringing cheer into our small home, if I could recognize cheer those days. I thought about the hypothesis that was gradually revealing itself to me. Other than the ghost on the coast, Gwenny, who I've barely touched on because she terrified me beyond reason, and the bastard vicar and the lovely Mr. Warburton, everything else had been an incursion, an intrusion from somewhere else. Mr. Warburton was a ghost protecting his property from an old rogue, which was a complete and independent tale with a beginning, a middle and an end. Gwenny? Maybe her appearance was an indicator of some external agency. The monster chickens were a clear manifestation of intent against us, while Gwenny had been an unfortunate consequence of past cruelties. I could go no further because I had very little information other than feelings. But what was obvious was that there was a lot of activity all of a sudden. As soon as something awkward or frightening finished, another one followed swiftly on its heels. Think of it in a different context. You launch attack after attack to discover an opponent's strengths and weaknesses, to cause injuries, damage, whatever. I followed the line of thought through to Shadow's injuries and looked across at him. "Tell me, is there worse to come?" He broke his preoccupied gaze and stared at the door and what he could see beyond for quite a while. "That's not a good sign," I said. The small black cat turned back to me, winced as he shuffled his legs and closed his eyes. At least he felt safe enough here to show weakness. Anyway, if my surmise was correct, there was plenty more trouble out there, and the only defense we had against it was lying on the sofa in a poorly state. I checked his food bowl and found it barely touched since breakfast, even though it was expensive salmon pâté, his favorite. I had theories, hypotheses rather, about most of what had happened, but I was still intrigued by the cheese. The cheese puzzled me. Maybe I should have asked alleged Satan. He seemed to be becoming central to everything that was happening. Maybe he'd know about the cheese. Things were happening here on the island that had a cause elsewhere, entirely elsewhere. And elsewhere I didn't even have the intellectual capacity to imagine. I knew I was right to be concerned, and equally, I guessed that any eventual solution would have nothing to do with me. I might not even make it out the other side. But something was coming, and right now when we needed a hero, he was injured, and maybe there was only me left. If that were the case, then we were well and truly doomed, because I didn't even possess the language to describe what was going on, let alone do something about it. All I could do was worry. But of course, I was smart enough to know there was no good health in worrying about things over which I had no control. But that didn't stop me. So, I reverted to my futile tarot education. While Shadow slept the cat's cure, I began creating my own set of tarot cards. I had to decide on new major and minor arcana. The 4 new suits would be ducks, mallets, flannels, and loose change. It was entertaining at least. The magician, justice and temperance proved a demanding and satisfying distraction. How to convey the symbology in a different form. So distracting was it, that another half a glassful of wine went into the freezer tray. Winner winner chicken dinner gravy. My sleep was fitful and quite distressing over those few days, as the content of bizarre nightmares kept cascading wildly over me, one after the other. None of the dreams made any sense, except I kept seeing the same monsters again and again, and I was constantly chased by monstrous indescribable creatures. All savagery and gross violence were being played out on some unknown landscape under frightening and stormy dark skies. The imagery was beyond my understanding, yet my body reacted with rushes of adrenaline that kept waking me up with cold sweats and a pounding headache. You can only turn your damp pillow over so many times before you have to accept the futility. I rose from my sticky, unsexually messed up bed a few times to check on Shadow, and found him very active in his unconscious state. I was too scared to try and wake him. I threw a few small logs on the fire to keep Shadow warm, then sat on the Parker knoll and watched him in his fevered throes. Only then did I begin to suspect that my nightmares might be leaking from Shadow's mind. What I saw may well have been the landscape through which Shadow moved when he wasn't here. Hordes of monstrous entities of appalling forms reached back to the distant purple foothills in his mental theater. They seemed to swell backward and forwards, waiting for an opportunity to inundate where I stood watching. The visceral horror and emotional stench of those awful dreams left me cold and terrified. I finally gave up the battle at 5:30, and went outside to escape Shadow's leaking mind, even though I felt dizzy from lack of sleep and the birds being too bloody noisy once again. Strangely, standing by his pallet table in the middle of my little garden, I finally found peace. It was at that time of day before the weather checked with the BBC for its identity for the day. The good news was that the BBC had decided that it would be fine and sunny with little cloud, and a temperature slightly below average at 17 degrees Celsius. It would do me fine. Dawn kept arriving earlier these days now that the trees behind the house had gone. I looked in again. Shadow looked as if he was entering a calmer period and was more comfortable in his slumber. So I left him for a while and wandered up to the greenhouse. Now the trauma of the building was over, I would delight myself with the small tomato plants. I beheld my greenhouse. I was still astonished I'd managed to rebuild the scary thing, and I loved it. That and the garden were the very few practical achievements of my life of which I was actually proud. It gave me great delight to slide open the double door and greet 30 tomato plants that would soon need repotting to larger pots. I stood there and contemplated the simple source of so much joy. The chilies also in there would need more heat than I could give them, and unless we had a wonderful hot summer, then I wasn't optimistic for a bumper harvest there. On the other hand, they would receive as much support as I could give them. The Rudbeckia plants in their 3-inch pots were robust with their large untidy leaves. Conversely, the petunias were only minuscule green things in their tray, but I knew they would put on a major spurt over the next 2 to 3 weeks. There would be a superabundance of calendula and French marigolds, and I decided to buy a few pots of sunflowers, not sure where I'd place them. I liked the thought of those wonderfully colorful and robust plants. Albeit briefly, this garden would reflect well on me after I'd gone. The greenhouse had been built east to west, and the south-facing roof panel would need painting with the white window cleaner. It was a large greenhouse, out in the open, and would have little shelter from intense midsummer heat. I checked whether any of the plants needed watering. Everyone was okay. But before I slipped away, I wished them well for the day and promised I'd be along for another chat later. Planning my garden delivered me to that pleasant dopamine-laced place of anticipatory delight. I turned and looked back at the cottage and thought about Shadow. The peace in my mind told me that either his fever had finally passed, or that he was awake. I was heading back for some breakfast and had taken no more than 5 paces when the entire world went seriously weird on me. It shifted a bit to the left and then down, accompanied by a massive bone-jarring cracking noise on an enormous scale. As I fell, I heard the greenhouse door crash to the ground, but thankfully there was no sound of breaking glass. I was in a bit of a dilemma as I pushed myself up onto my knees and then upright. Check the greenhouse first or Shadow? Quite sensibly, I chose the latter and dusted myself off. Shadow was very much awake and very much aware. He was standing upright on the sofa, quaking from the effort, and his eyes showed a sick panic and were sunk even deeper in his skull than in the last few days. The poor cat was shuffling backward and forwards, short steps, attempting to get himself off the sofa. There was another enormous crack, which faded immediately into an elemental grinding that I could feel in my knees. The contents of the room rattled and then thankfully settled down quickly. There were a further 3 cracks. They felt distant and gave me no concern for the crockery. Then no more. Stay there, you're no good to anyone in that state. I risked my life placing my hand flat on his back, and ever so gently I pushed him down against his feeble resistance. Then, sitting down next to him, I pulled out my phone. Have you taken your tablets? I checked where I'd placed them on the sofa and found none. He always took his tablets. What had just happened was more of a Saturday night Holyhead knee trembler than the infrequent harmless little 4 on the Richter scale. I checked various news sites on my phone and listened to the radio. There was nothing on the Daily Death supporting website, and they'd print a story about a farting pig. There was nothing. Not even the most pathetic seismic measuring device at the university could have missed that, especially if it were local. I looked down at Shadow and could see that he had his thinking hard face on and a fair bit of a tremor. Christ. He must be in so much pain to look this vulnerable. You're suppressing this all. It was a sudden realization. It was a statement of fact, not a question. If he could shut down an investigation by NASA and CERN, and everyone else, including the county council, then a local event shouldn't have been hard work for him. Yet it was. I'd made the hopeful error of thinking he was recovering well, but I'd been wrong. The effort to cloak the event was demanding all his energy, and the physical price he was paying for that was appalling. Shadow stayed like that for another hour. And in the end I was beginning to feel equally sick. And all I was doing was watching. He eventually conceded to my insistence that he drink some milk before passing out. I sat there with my hand resting gently on his back. His breathing was ragged and he felt far too warm to the touch. I was worried. Not only worried for his well-being, but at what he must be feeling about his lack of ability to respond to the latest crisis. I closed my eyes and leaned back. Each strange noise had had a distinct character, and so I tried to play back from memory each individual noise I'd heard, quite literally, the crepitous crack of the earth. I wouldn't have said that the noises were immediately local, however, I sensed their direction and I knew how to calibrate that. It's one of those rare superpowers a small number of humans possess, far more subtle than knowing when we've stepped in dog muck. I told Shadow I was going outside for a moment to see what I could see. The best view would be from the greenhouse, I told him. It was where I'd first heard and felt the noise. If I were going to close my eyes to rerun the event, then it should be there. It had to be the latest event. Like I said, one event followed the last, and although I couldn't see it, there had to be a connection with alleged Satan, seeing as it came so close after their meeting. It seemed as if there was a distinct progression toward a final resolution of whatever was going on. Shadow might know what it was, and I couldn't help but think that his growing list of injuries had something to do with it. I stood there and contemplated the noise I'd heard, and knew that it wasn't something physical fracturing, despite the possible similarity. In between my ears, I could feel it as something under pressure being released or forced through, maybe like a pseudo-earthquake. But in the context of recent events, don't ask me why, it sounded like something being forced into the world in the form of a crack, which brought me back to the nothings. I replaced the door on its frame rollers and closed it. That done, I went back to where I'd been standing before my fall, as it were. I closed my eyes and rotated slowly, replaying as many of the components of the falling down event and the cracking sounds in my head, until I could feel their source direction. I divined that the first noise had come from above my closed right eye. And the height was a line rising away from that point at a gentle incline. When I opened my eyes, I knew the noises had come from a line vaguely northeasterly to southwesterly across the island. I looked at Bordarvorn Mountain. Beyond it was Ligui Beach, which was an excellent place for kitesurfing and the most godforsaken cold place in winter. I wasn't going kitesurfing, only surfing with my geopsychic skill. Bordarvorn is a geologically inert aspiring mountain a few miles to the east-northeast. It has a lovely lake with the occasionally abandoned duck, and is a beautiful heather landscape. I wondered if the ducks had even noticed the recent tearing asunder of reality. Returning to the cottage, I told Shadow what I'd surmised, aware that from the outside it would have sounded silly, rushing to tell a cat about an imminent alien invasion through some hole in nothing. An intrusion incursion? I wasn't sure. This stuff was more nausea creating than infinity. Bordarvorn was an odd place, and I wondered how long it'd be before the locals noticed giant six-legged minotaurs in full battle dress moving about the area. A thought struck me, and I'm not sure why it seemed relevant at the time, but Anglesey is ancient and some places oozed a foreboding ancientness. So I dug out my old Ordnance Survey Anglesey map, which was dog-eared, torn and ancient, a bit like me. I carefully opened the poorly folded map as I shared my little theory with Shadow, or insight to be more accurate. The little black cat appeared to listen intently while doing whatever else he was doing. Whatever it was taking up all his energy and he looked appallingly ill. Suppressing awareness of another intrusion on top of a serious physical injury was damaging him. That was the last thing any human in the know needed right then. I got on my knees before the sofa. Listen, I said. Whatever you're doing, stop it. If the world's in danger, then just let it find out about it. Right? You know they'll probably ignore it because that's what we humans generally do with anything we don't understand. So you rest, and let us face it for a change. I could have sworn he shook his head. Could have been an itch in his ear. Really, I insisted. I mean it. Step back. I need you to do that, so I can go and find out what's going on. His eyes were focused elsewhere and he gave no indication that he'd heard me. I sat back on my haunches, becoming rather upset that this brave little creature was taking a hit for humanity, and humanity couldn't be bothered in the least. His body continued to give off pathetic little shudders. Do you hear me? If there's crap going on out there, let it happen. Let people find out about it. I let out a sigh of surrender and frustration and rubbed my eyes in tiredness and growing concern. I spoke softly. Shadow. We're really not worth it. They won't even notice, and you're no use if you die. You're a soldier. There's no one more pragmatic than a soldier. So switch off for a few hours and I'll go out there for a recce and I'll come back and report. I almost wept when the tremor stopped and his eyelids half opened and revealed his usually bright and sharp eyes to be dulled by strain. He closed them and became so worryingly still that I had to hold my hands either side of this abdomen to convince myself that he was still breathing. Thankfully he was, and I let out an exhausted breath. Good, I said. Stay like that for a while, please. Still on my knees, I turned my attention back to the map and traced my finger from Bordavaun to Thligwy burial chamber on the road from the anchored Moilver roundabout. Then I found Dean Thligwy, the ancient fort, and the Chapel of Ease just up from the beach and in front of the woods that separated it from Dean Thligwy. To the far south is Dean Sylvie. I just knew that was irrelevant to this particular quest. To the west and slightly south, and I was choosing the most obvious ancient sites, there was the burial chamber at Cable Bay near Rosniga. And then another burial chamber not all that far from the Menai Straits at Plascock. There were about 100 known ancient sites on Anglesey, some no more than standing stones, though some were mistaken basps, bovine arse scratching points. I found St. Mary's Church Tal Athlin and considered that for a moment. There was no time to think too deeply about any of the sites, and I chose to follow my instincts and intuition. It was circled on the map along with the others that I identified and felt relevant, and joined them up in a vague straight diagonal line of best fit between Ligwy and Rosniga. I settled down with my back against the sofa and had another good look at the map, again sending my mind and memory around the island to those other places I'd visited so many times over the years. Those identified locations made sense of that curious synergistic ancient tang I was tasting or feeling right then. I marked a few more places on the map, then my mind slipped to another place, namely the island entire. I tried to imagine how it must have been those countless centuries ago, way before the island had become the breadbasket of Wales, and eventually the basket case. Your basic Roman grunt was terrified of the dreaded Druids, especially on this their magical island power base. Given a choice, the Roman grunt would sooner face a horde of Visigoths than a single Druid. Anglesey was imbued with a dangerous ancient magic that was felt as far away as Emperor Nero's court in Rome. In those ancient times, when the island was covered in forests, the Druids would have conducted their ceremonies in secret groves within those deep dark forests. And I don't think any of those ancient locations had been chosen arbitrarily, but rather for something magical or extraordinary about them. Perhaps there had always been more to these places than just a feeling, but a reality, a tension caused by forces more pronounced and more real. I'm heading out for a look, I said, and rose with the mandatory middle-aged groan and then slow disentangled my knees. I looked down at the small black cat, a warrior undoubtedly, but he looked awfully shrunken in his illness and exhaustion. I placed an antibiotic tablet, a painkiller and an anti-inflammatory on the sofa cushion next to him and held the back of my fingers gently against his nose. It felt as if he was burning up. Try to take these when you can. They'll help with the inflammation. And drink some milk. You're burning up, little friend, so please don't do anything until I get back. All right? Not a thing. Just let us humans expand our experience so we can diminish our idiot-inflated egos of superiority. I allowed myself a little titter. I sound like a liberal lefty. Shadow failed to get the joke. The jury was still out on whether he actually had a sense of humor. Sarcasm isn't necessarily humor. It took me just under 20 minutes to get to Bordavaun, driving slowly and carefully in my other wounded warrior, followed by a fatiguing climb up to the mighty peak. I jest. It took 3 minutes to trot up to the mighty peak from another Neanderthal-inspired car park. Along the way from home I hadn't encountered any fleeing members of the public, nor seen any of the emergency services. It seemed that as far as the residents of the island were concerned, nothing untoward had happened. There were no platoons of heavily armed six-legged beasts abroad, and neither was Satan, Ahriman, whatever he wanted me to believe he was. Standing beside the triangulation point atop, I had to conclude that nothing had not definitely happened here or hereabouts. This was an Anglesey double negative, meaning that something probably had happened, only it couldn't be perceived in any way other than as a feeling. Here on top of this aspiring Anglesey mountainette, I leaned my lower back against the concrete triangulation point, and stared down in the direction of Lligwy Beach and south toward Moelvre and the Lligwy burial chamber. And from there to where I guessed that Chapel of Ease and Ancient Fort were. Again, nothing out of place. I reflected on the spots where events had occurred. The nasty stuff that had happened when the sun was either setting or later, after witching hour. I've long believed that our ghosts only tend to manifest themselves during those brief periods of twilight. They are those shadows that move. It's probably more ninja for a ghost to disguise itself as a shadow, an illusion, maybe just like my injured little mate. Nothing there. Nothing obvious anyway. Despite the lack of interest by the people who lived along the line I'd drawn on the map, I knew that whatever I was looking for would be pretty obvious. I had no idea what it would be, but I expected to recognize it when I saw it. On the way down, I nearly ran into a Labrador sniffing up the path, ignorant of anyone other than the odor trail it was following. A good-looking, petite dark-haired lady about my age came up and apologized, explaining that her dog had undoubtedly been a detective in a previous life, and would leave no trail unsniffed. We smiled at each other and I almost asked her if she'd seen or felt anything odd. I decided not to, and trotted back to the car. There was nothing going on at the burial chamber. The Chapel of Ease ruins seemed okay from the road. I could neither sense nor hear anything from beyond the band of trees where you find the old fort. Even though I was very concerned about shadow, I stuck to my task as the morning gave way to afternoon and early evening. I paid a quick visit to as many of the sites as I could in a fast drunkard's tour through the heart of the island. As daylight began to dissolve into the twilight, I found it more difficult to dismiss my concern for Shadow. I began to worry whether he was still alive. Nonetheless, I chose to believe in his will and determination, and continued with my mission as promised. I couldn't return empty-handed, because I suspected there was too much at stake to be casual. Shadow would never forgive me. The job first, I'm sure he'd insist. All seemed okay and more ideal as evening picnic locations than a place for close encounters. If those locations were anything to go by, then the opening of the sky to another universe augured nothing more than a pleasant evening. However, I still expected that whatever was happening would be unmistakable and would be taking place in what I considered an ancient power spot. Most roads on the island do take you quite close to most of these locations, because the routes have been established by feet and hooves over thousands of years. After all, a trade route is a trade route between communities, and most were still where they'd always been. I was aiming for Cable Bay in the southwest. I wanted to check the burial chamber there, out on the headland where I used to snorkel and big brown crabs would extend their claws upwards toward my bits. Before I set off from Moelvre, I planned my route to follow the road that ascended and descended the mighty slopes of Bordarvorn, hang a right for Manardween, turn right for Bacchai and Flanach Med. From there to Trevor across the staggered crossroad toward the expressway, then over it and follow the road for a couple of miles past the turning for Roosniger at Llanvilog. Dark clouds were gathering from the southwest and soon the sky was covered, and any benefits of a clear sky extending the daylight was gone. It might even rain. The good news was that I managed to make it through Flanach Med without anyone throwing sheep at me. It's always a nervous little drive, that one, and I took care. It's a ridge road with a beautiful and very distracting view both sides. Even in the day's dying light on the road out of Flanach Med toward the hamlet of Carmel, there was the wonderful view towards Snowdonia to the east and the sea to the west. It really did pay to be aware and careful on this road because I had a great deal on my mind. And with respect to that day's challenge, I didn't really know what to do, even if I did find something out of the ordinary. My little furry friend was grievously wounded and there was a potentially imminent end of the world scenario developing around here somewhere. The residue of Shadow's frightening dream suddenly seemed much more significant, and given what we'd both been experiencing, even though I didn't understand it, I knew it would be foolish to dismiss any of it. I was driving too quickly along that winding road to Carmel and barely acknowledged the public toilet in front of the chapel and the small group of houses. Arriving at the crossroads in Trevor 2 miles later, I was halfway across the road when the silliness of it struck me. I didn't stay there for very long because I knew that the local yobbos generally put their foot down going through. I needed to think, so I pulled up in front of the old post office. I reflected on demographics for a moment. For instance, if you bothered to carry out a head count of the population of Carmel, then you'd probably have come up with no more than maybe 30. The people either lived in private homes or council houses and bungalows. Each home would have its own bathroom. Carmel is off the main track, and yet it had its own public convenience. There was just no need for a public convenience in Carmel. You need only step 100 yards in any direction and you could pee at a hedge with impunity, male or female. I once went out with a girl from Carmel, A wild thing she was too, became a teacher. The one thing I knew about Carmel is that there had been no public toilet there then. Neither had there been one when Shadow and I passed through on one of his recent evening tours. I performed a U-turn and went back up the way I'd come and forgot about Cable Bay for now. I'd seen an obvious anomaly and wanted to check it out. It was growing dark, and if you added local karma it would probably be pitch black before long. Any ghosts would long ago have dissolved into the general darkness, and left me with whatever new thing that might be out there. I arrived in this barely there piece of local geography and turned left off the Llanacmead Road to park opposite the large empty chapel and a handful of homes in the small terrace. That chapel, and a few more in the middle of nowhere, really saddened me. It would once have been the social and spiritual center of the hamlet and many of the farms around and about. It made me wonder if the church a few hundred yards away was faring any better. My mum's chapel closed a few years ago because 90-year-olds finally had to give up the struggle up 2 sets of steps every Sunday. All around me, there were far too many signs in plain sight that bore testimony to a lost era of close community. There was no joy to be found there, so I allowed it to slide aside and be replaced by the intrigue of the unexpected new public convenience. It shouldn't be there. Surely. Again there was that coppery tang on my tongue I'd come to associate with weird shit. This was definitely the bleedin' obvious I'd been searching for. It was a curious structure. Just off, if you can understand that. I leaned back on the bonnet of my poor Ford Focus and stared at something that looked like a toilet designed by someone who'd never used one before. That's what struck my conscious mind, way before the thick human part caught up. One of my many deficiencies aside, the block was about 15 feet long, 8 wide, and about 8 feet tall, all rendered in concrete painted white. It was a rectangular block of the type the island's finest usually came up with, and there was something definitely off about it. I circled around it at a safe distance. Everything was there. A door in the middle of the long wall for disabled access, at the chapel end a female sign above a closed single door, and a male sign and door on the car side. It was a perfect little country toilet, save for a few apparent challenges you'd have to consider on using it. One, and probably the most important from a utilitarian perspective, if you were ever to enter with a view to dropping your trousers in there, then as you bent down you would probably headbutt the wall or door. Same for the ladies, I reckoned. As for the disabled loo with its radar key lock, it was barely wide enough to reverse a wheelchair through, before you even began the complicated task of maneuvering. Therefore, I concluded that my surmise led by nose was correct. Weird shit was here manifest. It was definitely something to share with Shadow. This public convenience offered no convenience whatsoever. The mail door was slightly ajar inwards, the other two were closed. All was silent except for the muffled sound of a television coming from one of the terraced houses where the old shop used to be. There was a light on behind the curtains in each downstairs window and I could see movement in the one nearest. It was an ordinary evening that had darkened a bit earlier than usual. I came back to the mail door. As a rule I don't hang around public toilets, and felt no immediate urge to push it inwards or enter. However, there was a screaming voice of warning bouncing around inside my head and I chose to acknowledge it. I couldn't see anything in there. Twilight had long waved over its shoulder and gone to Betty Bobo's, leaving nothing but a cold echoing darkness in there. I gathered my wits and stepped up to the door, gently pushed it in with my foot and took a quick step back. The door swung in smoothly and silently, definitely not a local job. There was still a sliver of color in the sky behind the houses, and after a few moments my eyes became accustomed enough to discern the different shades of dark. I could see into an interior that appeared darker than it should be. It felt as if I was staring into an expanding blackness that was on the verge of coming out to meet me. It was a blackness that presented no sense of depth whatsoever, even though I could see it. If there were in existence a solid black rectangular block of black, then I had a great example of that before me. At least it didn't appear to be collapsing inwards like the nothings. I'd learned to trust my tummy on matters of uncertainty, and right then my tummy was turning somersaults. And the smell. The smell was so appalling that none of the pub toilets I'd encountered on bus-chauffeured pub crawls across the island could ever have competed. Human waste hosts a few chemical compounds that act as a warning that it's offensive, foul, and dangerous to health. I had to take a few steps back because the stench was making me want to retch. It was familiar. And, all of a sudden I just wanted to lay down on the ground and sleep. Thankfully, and independent of the internal thinking me, an essential survival instinct kicked in. I was able to stagger back a few feeble steps in search of fresh air. The heavy lethargy faded as if by a universal inverse square law. I'll add another item to my observations about the building. Namely, in spite of the crippling ambience too close to the door, I felt an appalling compulsion to enter into that darkness. When I usually went to the toilet, it was my bladder or bowels doing the compelling. This was new. My feet wanted to creep forward and drag me in. I fought that mad desire with all my willpower. I'd become aware that this weird stuff was happening all the time around the island. Therefore, armed with a reasonable understanding and a healthy sense of unconscious self-preservation, I relaxed and stopped fighting the urge, which in turn faded away. By resisting, I'd awarded it with credibility and thereby a power over me. By yielding, I had undermined that mechanism of compulsion. I could still feel the urge in me, but I'd managed to push it back far enough that I could step right up to the door. I let out a long breath to clear my head and strained to see anything in the darkness. Nothing. It was like a solid black hole in there, stealing any light and not willing to reveal itself. I was sure it could only be a place of joy for the thing that was manifesting it, and as far as I was concerned, there certainly was no need for a toilet that demanded I step into it. I was spared doing anything precipitous when the lights came on with a clack, clack, clack. 3 simple fluorescent tubes covered by an opaque diffusing shield set in the ceiling. Very ordinary and precisely what you would have expected to find in a public convenience. The rest was equally mundane. However, there were a few things that did suggest all was not ordinary in there. Notwithstanding the unseen, it was what it appeared to be, a perfectly clean and tidy loo. At the far end opposite the door at about a dozen paces, were 3 ceramic washbasins, each with a clean stainless steel mirror above it. To their left was a recess down which I suppose would have been the stalls and urinals. The floor was covered in immaculately clean terracotta red tiles and the ceiling and walls were covered with what I guessed was a washable white plastic. This was a glorious loo that didn't look as if it had ever been used and was identical in its ambition to the tens of thousands all over the country. If it was me who built that public convenience, then I'd have been very happy with myself. I only had one minor issue with the entire thing. The inside seemed to be far larger than the outside. Here we go, I thought. Another portal to heaven only knew where. In my mind I was back on the sofa and talking to the cat. Why me, I said. And I heard him reply cynically, why not? Here was a loo that screamed, do come in, won't you? I wouldn't mind in the least if you missed the urinal. I wouldn't mind at all. Too bloody true you wouldn't. I guessed that there would be a similar distortion of space and time in each of the other 2 doorways, all for some morally distorted bastard's entertainment or eventual nourishment. Just thinking of the impossible dimensions to this tidy monstrosity, an intrusion from another universe or whatever. It made me feel queasy just trying to make sense of it. I saw my own face reflected in the center metal mirror. I was an image lit up and suspended in the darkness outside the doorway. I stared at myself in that cruel light. For most people, all they would ever know of us, if they cared, is what we present in the mirror. And I'd long grown weary and indifferent to my face, no longer seeing it even when I was shaving. I was as invisible to myself as I was to the rest of the world. Why go to all the effort to create this impossible place, just to give me a mirror to look in? Then I saw something that instinctively made me look away before looking back, glad that the face I had just seen in the mirror wasn't mine. The anguished face that stared back at me in shock and horror from behind the central mirror will probably stick with me forever. It was lost in a shocking torment and a complete abandonment of hope. Bloody fists pounded soundlessly against the steel mirror in hopeless despair from within. It distorted as it howled silently at me. I recognized the face that expressed a torture beyond anything I could even have imagined. Thankfully, it wasn't mine. However, it was a face that was familiar to me, and once a bloody-minded obstruction during my years as an advocate. This tormented soul was one particularly cold and nasty individual. If someone had meant to take advantage of my sympathy as a weakness, he or she had made a terrible mistake. It was the face of one of our noble county councillors, Evil Reg, who I remembered lived in one of the terrace houses 30-odd yards away. Ignore the horrible distortion for a moment, and it was definitely Councillor Reginald Roberts pounding the mirror soundlessly for rescue. Evil Reg was the nosiest person alive, and if anyone was going to inspect the unexpected new public convenience in hope of finding something to steal, then it was him. Whether it was a mirror I was staring at dispassionately or a transdimensional telly with the volume turned down, I didn't know. All I did know is that I was standing there outside an unexpected public convenience in Carmel, of all places, and the vision in the mirror was reaching down into some sub-base existential emotions on the subject of unbearable terror. I should have been far more concerned for the person trapped wherever he was, but the word karma kept popping up. Evil Reg, like his cousin Evil Ted, had never been good looking. Yet, he was reported as having an active sex life among the wives of those making planning applications and vying for teaching jobs. It was reported that many mothers had lain themselves down before this appalling angular foulness, a sacrifice for their children's teaching careers or to get a conservatory in a protected zone. I'd been told that I've got this singular neutral expression that barely changes no matter how appalling the news I receive. I call it my learned game face, and at that very moment I knew that there was nothing I could do. Evil Reg was staring back at me and beseeching me for help, and as I say, I have a neutral face and it must have looked to him as if I didn't care. I think he was right. I had no specific vengeful thoughts flashing through my mind. There was nothing. It was a face resulting from too many crises and one recently reinforced from fighting demons and satanic forces. What was actively occupying my thinking was, why am I seeing this? Whatever was happening to Evil Reg inside this anomaly was irrelevant, because my role was to gather data for Shadow's consideration. For all I knew, he might already be taking it out of my mind. I just didn't know, because that damned cat gave absolutely no hint of what he was thinking or doing. Feeding important information to the human seemed to be low on everyone's list of priorities right now. The scenario was designed to terrorize me of all people. If I was expected to step in to save Evil Reg, then someone had severely underestimated me. I remembered that such conveniences have a cold echo, and I wondered how a banjo would sound in there. It was Reg's cruelty in the past that had constructed this indifference. And it was clear that his investment in being a complete bastard hadn't yielded any useful dividends in the end. There was a loud clack again, and Reg disappeared as the solid block of darkness fell heavily. Seriously. It fell heavily. There was a presence in my head that certainly wasn't my imagination, and it wasn't my unconscious encouraging the usual cowardice. I couldn't understand the language used, and curiously neither could I hear a voice. However, something resonated gratingly, and I knew someone or thing was communicating with me. It was an echo that was expanding to encompass me and a direct order to enter the black void. That's the thing when there's no actual voice communicating with you, either it's delusional or something is reaching into you at a cellular level. A cruel sardonic smile barged into my head and made me stagger backwards. Him again. A third time. My feeble mind might have chosen to be intrigued into the darkness, but thankfully it was my unconscious and body doing the necessary survival shit. What my body had seen was the darkness bulge solidly out a good 2 yards beyond the frame of the door, as if it were treacle falling insanely sideways toward me. It held there for one mad moment and then snapped back with a ghostly hiss. That was the good part. What was left gave the distinct impression that its purpose was to offend. This was not the open hand of friendship reaching out from one universe to another. Instead, it was another olfactory assault that the fragrance of 1,000 Karsis gathered together could never match. Need one ask who was back and engaging with me? You really do stink, don't you? And again there was an uncanny sense of a self-indulgent, patronizing smile over a pointless little victory. The diffuse lights from the houses nearby were shining out in vague quadrilaterals across the small frontages, and shadows could clearly be seen wandering about indoors. The ordinary indoors and the extraordinary outdoors. Just what was going on? This was an incursion. Even though I could see no stars in there, I did wonder whether I was looking into the fathomless black infinity of deep space. Reg crossed my mind briefly as I wondered how he was getting on in there. I knew he wouldn't be going home to his missus this evening, or any other evening for that matter. I guessed that Evil Reg was about to become the legend of the disappearing county councillor on the front page of the Daily Death. Punctual to that set of thoughts, the lights all clacked on again, and before I could register whether Evil Reg was as previously, all I saw was the impossible end wall of the impossible public convenience expand out at me with a frightening alertness. I staggered back in fright as a toilet skilled far beyond odor was almost on me. The lights clacked off and the solid darkness came to an abrupt stop a few feet from me. The deep blackness became a mirror. Except my image was missing. Evil Reg's face was suddenly before me again, still trapped in his mirror. His circumstances remained unchanged. That close, there was too much detail as I inspected the silent wailing mouth, more wet-gummed than toothed, and despairing tearful wide eyes in terrified non-understanding and agony, beseeching me to rescue him. I knew what was about to happen for my benefit. I just couldn't look away, and a freezing wave of horror I shall never forget coursed through me like a charge of electricity. Reg's hands went to his temples and failed to hold his head together when it exploded and smeared the black mirror with remnants of his skull bones and brains. One of his eyes had pulped against the mirror, as the other, distinctly misshapen, slid pathetically down the mirror and suddenly dropped out of sight. There was a momentary hiatus that was then broken by an explosion of blood that drenched the mirror. Councillor Reg Roberts had definitely left the building, leaving most of himself still in there for my appalled delectation. I knew that in ordinary times this would have been an appropriate moment for a scream. Yet, although I was shocked, I didn't scream. I wished to vomit, but I didn't. This was not the kind of crap I wanted to get used to. I'd either become inhuman, or someone was interfering in my head again. Shadow must have been looking through my eyes and fortifying me. Better he looked through mine than evil Reg's. Crap. Reg was conscious when he popped. I held that horrible thought. I think that's called an earworm supplementing a new visual variant in my PTSD. It introduced in me a minor desire for alcohol, but it passed quickly. Maybe it's reasonable to want a shot of the hard stuff when someone's head explodes a foot or so away from yours. Used to be when it was just a shot of brandy and a stiff talking to about pulling yourself together. The bloody screen went dark, and with a distinct elastic snap that sounded like a rebounding jelly, the bulge of darkness withdrew slowly into the private space. I could also hear that insistent fawning voice without words continue to communicate with me somewhere in between my neurotransmitters. My entire body was aware of it, and I felt that even a person with a hearing impairment would have picked it up. It was mumbling and then suddenly angry. All I could feel was anger and resentment, seeking to diminish and embrace me. I focused on it. I concentrated on it objectively and realized that I might not be reacting as expected by the fabricator of the frightfulness I'd just witnessed. The voice dropped away, and the bastard who had drunk my wine chose a different tack. The bastard was clearly trying to break me. Why was beyond my understanding, because I was useless. I was no one, and I wished to continue to be no one. I knew that all this had been set up for me. Why? As I said, I was no one. But not to be deterred by my lack of enthusiasm for the project, the bastard chose another tack. One that I wouldn't be able to step away from confronting this time. It simultaneously persuaded all inhabitants of the half-dozen or so terraced homes to forego indoor plumbing and opt for the one outside. In turn, each front door opened up and the social zombies started drifting out like colored shadows passing through the light from each other's windows and open doorways. The first person I saw coming toward me was Irene, who always insisted on being called Renee because it sounded exotic. Evil Reg's wife, dressed warmly for the evening in her probably pink television viewing onesie romper suit. Irene was famous for laying into the old Liebfraumilch as soon as she heard the theme for evening news. Consequently, many people had changed their phone numbers to avoid her drunken vicious calls. At county council Christmas parties, she was renowned for rising up to quote from a familiar Welsh hymn and then projectile vomiting a pint or two of port onto a table or nearby wall. She was an ugly round blob at 5 feet 2 inches tall. Among her husband's colleagues, she was known as the Belfast woman because a councillor had once seen her pick up a Belfast sink to threaten an arc welder with a mouth on him. She was one of those women whose features hadn't been softened by the passing years. Irene was blessed with a tight purple perm, small black eyes that would intimidate a great white, and a square jaw that was broader than her forehead and could probably take 7 Gs at a fast Brands Hatch corner. Irene now moved with an elegance reminiscent of an automaton and the vacant eyes of a councillor receiving an important briefing. The remainder of her neighbors were in various states of dress or undress, men and women all. One small elderly bald fat man was in a string vest and his face showed that he was in mid-shave when the call came upon him. The small square in front of the chapel was filling up with people who were being drawn out for an explosive ending to their day and lives. The bastard was going out of his way to destroy me. I turned away from them and confronted the darkness directly. "Are you doing all this to frighten me?" I shouted my question into the thick blackness. "Okay, I'm frightened. You've got what you wanted, now leave these people alone." The zombie army was approaching at a reluctant shuffle that should have been comical in any other context. While their minds might have succumbed easily to his commands, each body's survival instinct was fighting back. Most were very elderly people who really should have been inside on their sofa, not outside being directed to enter a toilet of doom for a reason they wouldn't have been able to fathom. It was time for the soaps, and not tramping about outside in a desperate syncopation. They all gathered together and formed a ragged line behind Irene, the natural leader she always believed she should be. Irene's head snapped across to me and my presence seemed to distract her. I could see that even in her distracted zombie state her hatred of me broke through the trance. I have that effect on very few people. Only one as far as I knew, and she was staring directly at me with murder in her cold black eyes. I'd once told her to shut her filthy fishwife mouth during a public meeting on social services and mental health issues. Irene was a woman utterly untouched by compassion for any other living thing. In comparison, even evil Reg was angelic. She had been the greedy and conniving power behind his throne and the cause for his extracurricular activities. Also, I could see that her hatred of me was undiminished by the passing of time. Seeing me there seemed to draw her to her immediate reality and what was happening. It wouldn't have been the sense of foreboding that distressed her but the lack of control. Her eyes registered an unaccustomed terror. She began to flail her arms around and struggle against her unwanted forward motion. None of the other elderly couples and individuals seemed to notice as the queue slowed up behind Irene. I jumped in front of her and placed both my hands against her broad shoulders and shouted at her to resist. She was no more than a dozen steps from the toilet entrance, and the army of the elderly seemed to be waking up and beginning to panic and wail. If the bastard who I knew was in there wanted to scare me, then he'd found the perfect way, right there in the terrified eyes of vulnerable people. I was almost a foot taller than Irene, and yet I found myself being pushed backwards towards the door by the force that was impelling her forward. "You're not worth dying for," I told myself as I struggled to push her back. It was impossible, and I felt as if I was pushing against their collective force. Sensibly, callously to my conscience, I let her go in order to save myself and do my best with those behind her. Even before I could move aside, our eyes locked again, and her hand shot out and grabbed my arm and drew me toward her in a Belfast sink grip. No matter how hard I fought, I found myself being dragged backwards towards our shared doom in a cold and silent nowhere. I'm ashamed to say that I struck at the woman with my free hand. But such was her terror that she was immune and beyond physical pain. So a nice day's intended communion with the tomatoes had been transformed into a fight for my life. I'd never been so glad to see a six-legged minotaur in my life. They weren't cows, but they had 6 appendages, 4 for quadrambulation and the others for tool work like us. It lent them a distinctly Taurian look. The bull-like face was long, broad and high with a receding forehead. The eyes were set forward and above something I might describe as a flattened human nose and an animal's snout. These were of the same disciplined military bearing I'd seen rushing from the red to the dark door when Shadow blew up the evil bastard's joy pleasure trap. They had that smell I had anticipated in elite troops and killers. Standing upright on their 4 legs, they were well over 8 feet tall. Those portions of their bodies in sight or within tight dark armor of their upper bodies and flanks were massively muscled. Their necks were immense and thickly corded, and they wore a broad utility belt packed with stuff, and a weapon that might pass for a machine gun had it not been about 3 times the size of anything a human might bring into a conflict. A large hand fell over Irene's clawing grasp and casually pulled us apart. I groaned in severe pain as her nails dug in. We were both pushed sideways back toward my car, and I fell to the floor, banging my head against the fender. I was temporarily dazed and fascinated by the massive murderer's hand as it pulled away. It was unusual to see 3 large digits versus a long opposable finger or thumb. My gaze followed the hand back up to its owner, and I looked beyond the massive head to what I knew to be soldiers working with a cold, efficient and well-rehearsed professionalism. It could well have been the same arm that had pulled me away from the mutually consuming monster chicken turkeys and saved my life. About a dozen of these brutal-looking creatures paid no attention to the niceties as they lifted and carried away the terrified elderly residents of Carmel. I saw that rough professional courtesy that soldiers exhibit toward civilians in the way, and I couldn't help but appreciate an amusing irony that these humans were being herded by cows. A hand gripped mine and pulled me roughly up and to one side. The bovine analogy was prolonged by the deep and resonant lowing voice. "You the one attending after old one?" he demanded sharply. That was all I could manage in my stunned state. The soldier stared at me, puzzled by my reaction. He stood a moment and his eyes wandered off to regard what his soldiers were doing. "Yes you are," he said offhandedly, and then turned his attention back to me. "Step back please." The words held no import of diplomacy. No courtesy, only a direct order. I stumbled back. "Old one? Shadow?" I nodded in a vague understanding to this fearsome warrior. "Just who are you?" He said something that sounded like a car crash of consonants connected by violent intonation, and I think he was saying, "Arta, commander of his honor guard and battle group." He saw that my confusion grew rather than diminished. "Step back," he repeated, and gently and forcefully pushed me away against my car with his hand on my chest. As I did, one of the soldiers grabbed Irene, and I swear it offered her a winning grin that made her scream hysterically. It winked at me too. The worst that the evening should have offered these poor people should have been the weather report. Not this. A platoon of giant alien warriors and a mysterious magical siren toilet that continued to call out to them. I decided to stand where I was told and viewed the order being established among the chaos by motivated and dangerous-looking soldiers. Honor guard. Praetorians. This was a pretty serious-looking group of individuals gathered around a singular purpose, one with which they all seemed very familiar. There were a dozen of them working in 3 teams of 4. 2 of the groups were establishing a safety cordon and pushing the locals back toward their homes. It must have been a nightmare for them all. I wondered how they were going to explain this to Echot in the morning. Mind you, these Minotaur cows' bulls had to make the problem disappear first. I saw no panic among these warriors as they worked to solve what looked to be a familiar problem. A pair of rapid-moving car lights shot past the turning on the main road 100 yards below us and carried on, heading out into sheep-throwing country. I wondered what that driver was thinking. Like the rest of humanity viewing any crisis, they would have denied and discarded the very reality of what they might have just seen. One group of 4 warrior beasts remained focused on the problem item, namely the loo. Brusque hand signals came from the one who had spoken to me. He bellowed a command that set the 4 to work. They set out 6 large metal cylindrical devices, each about 3 feet high and a foot in diameter. One was placed in each corner of the building and the center of each length. Each device was connected to the others in a very simple manner by corded cables plugging into the base of the cylinders. The devices appeared scuffed and well worn, and I could see black tape on 1 or 2 that suggested some jury-rigged repairs. These were workaday devices and tools of their unknown trade. Arta, their commander, nodded to me once again and beckoned me toward him. He took my arm in a firm grip and pulled me to him, and quite naturally I resisted. I felt angry at being judged for things beyond my control. "Don't worry. We friends. Look." He pointed at the structure that was no longer a white concrete public convenience, but a piece of another space contrived to appear indigenous. I could see the edges blur and flicker and sparkle momentarily. Not correct for this Earth location. An intrusion, I said. I got the impression that I was being regarded as little more than one of the poor stupid humans that were being herded. He doesn't say much. I've only just recently worked it out. I looked around at the heroes busy with their tasks, just arrived in the nick of time to save us. "Too many intrusions," said my bellicose bovine hero, who was speaking with a vague familiarity with English. The heavy consonants made me think that he'd be better off speaking in Welsh. "Not first tonight." He shook his head in disgust. "I know who did this." I found myself shouting over the noise of equipment being connected and the shouting of the soldiers informing each other of something or other in turn. The residents had been bullied back into their homes and the entire place was lit up, although I had no idea of the source of the light. We were just lit up and there were no shadows to obscure any work being carried out. "Perhaps we know," he shouted back at me. "New problem. Ahriman." The commander stared at me thoughtfully for a moment, considering what I'd said, and then looked away while answering me. "One of many name." I realized I was only being awarded the privilege of a briefing by their commander because of my association with Shadow. It certainly wasn't because of any particular skill I'd brought to this strange party. He unclipped a device from his back harness, about the size of a mobile phone appropriate to the hands using it, and again it was clearly a well-used device and handled with practiced familiarity. The commander leaned forward, pointed it into the darkness and took a moment to consider whatever reading he was picking up. He reflected on that for a moment and then shook his massive head. "This one stronger. This one for you." This great warrior who seemed to defer only to Shadow looked worried. "Too strong. Old one will be troubled." "How's it happening?" I asked. "Someone more bad than we." "That's very bad then?" I thought the commander laughed. It was difficult to say in those early days. His large face turned to me and stabbed me with an icy stare before slapping me on the upper arm. At which point I lost all feeling in it. "Is there anyone more bad than you?" I was surprised that anyone could be tougher than this gang. The bull's head shook and again I suspected that a broad grin was being offered instead of a piercing stare. "No," he said with a wide sweeping wave encompassing the deployed troops and then pointed at me and himself. "And Old One," he said, and his voice reflected an unexpected concern. "Together. Same mission. We thought Old One dead after last mission." Good to hear his voice. "He is our leader and friend of many battles. Today you join us. But you continue to look after him. He may save you again. This," he pointed at the revealed structure, "for you. Adversary not like you. Maybe scared." "Adversary?" I asked. "Ahriman. Another name." Before I could investigate that, a voice barked out something in their language and we both looked to the public convenience that seemed to be stripping itself of its artifice. Finally, all I could see was a rectangular block of solid blackness standing aloof from everything else. It made no sense whatsoever, so I just added it to the list of the other recent impossible things I'd seen and experienced. The commander nodded to the soldier who had shouted, a giant beast of a creature with a different colored harness. The technicians withdrew from the intrusion, formed a circle around the blackness about 20 feet out and turned their back to it. Each soldier checked the colleague on either side. All this was routine for them, which I found interesting. Finally, they all pulled out a massive blade from their pack, and slammed it into the ground until it found solid purchase. They held it firmly. The commander shouted, "Ready." Someone barked a reply. "Ready to deploy on your instruction." I was pulled roughly to one side and pushed down so that I had the commander between me and the intrusion. I wondered what they would do next, when the massive blade stabbed into the tarmac beside me and I gasped. By the movement I heard immediately behind me, I sensed that a signal had been given. Close eyes. A switch must have been flicked somewhere because all the lights went out. I felt suddenly weightless and nauseous and began to drift backward until a heavy hand fell on my shoulder and pushed me forward. There was more organized shouting behind me, unaccompanied by any sense of disorder. Yet again I was surprised by my reaction. I felt trepidation for the unknown and was not burdened by it. In all, it probably lasted no more than a few seconds by my reckoning. And with a now familiar crepitus crack, we were pushed forward by a force and then drawn back against the background of a whomp. Whatever had occurred had involved both a substantial input and output of energy. Not bad. Only a few minutes after arriving they'd casually closed up a hole in space and probably time with hardly any fuss. Why hadn't they been around when the evil twins destroyed my little woodland? Mind you, I wouldn't have my greenhouse if they had. The hand on my shoulder released me and I could hear an unreasonable number of joints click as the commander rose to all his feet. "Get up," he shouted to be heard above all the other voices and activity. I rose rather too quickly and embarrassed myself by vomiting. The commander patted me on my shoulder before moving forward. Another voice rasped something close to my ears. "So the old bastard's still alive, is he?" I looked up and it was the soldier previously addressed by his leader. Now, the commander was a big person, but this one seemed a good foot taller and far broader. He actually smiled when a green-faced me nodded confirmation. Many people not happy with this good news. He looked at me directly and observed my condition. It is normal in beginning. Repairing breach is always uncomfortable even for us, but we familiar. All here still feel bad. We stood next to each other and I found myself dwarfed. Both of us watched the others dismantle equipment and revealed what was now a shallow indentation in the middle of the road. It felt so normal standing next to this giant without referring to the remainder that stretched behind. After all, a person is always a person, whether bald or disliking hats and banjo music. All is an aspect of the person, and just a color on the person palette. What about the man inside? If inside, gone. Destroyed. Bastards always choose one in whatever community to draw people close. He put his arm around my shoulder. You resisted to save another person. Brave. Difficult. The old bastard trained you well. The destroyed man, you know him? A bad man, I said simply. The images disturbed me. The loss didn't. He shrugged. Then no problem. What about everyone else here? I asked as the commander returned and answered the obvious question. I could imagine seeing all of the neighbors on the BBC News in their Sunday best complaining about six-legged cows and being ridiculed. You'll never keep this a secret. They say nothing. This beyond their experience. Too big for cultural mind. They say nothing. Simple. Human thinking very entertaining. That did make sense. Captain James Cook's South Sea experience yet again. True or not, it made sense in this context. That's humans for you. How was Shadow injured so badly? I asked the commander. He looked at me quizzically and after a quick calculus must have realized that the only thing we had in common was the cat. Shadow. Good name. He not tell you what happening? No. He shrugged. Then I don't. He turned to view his soldiers clearing and removing the final pieces of equipment from the site. When his attention returned to me again, his eyes were dark. He good friend and bad enemy. Be careful. I've already worked that out. Did I see you and your colleagues when that place blew up a while back? I recognize you, yes. This breach, I was learning new terminology all the time. How did you know about it? Circumstances demand we monitor for breaches here continually, this island place. This most potential dangerous today. Our mutual friend call indicating you in danger. He regard you well. Doesn't show it. He laughed out loud. He never do. You go now as do we. Leave people here to solve own problem in normal human way. They be fine. Blame the weather? Why not? Now we go. Best for you too. He moved away on all four legs with a strong purpose, and you could sense the power of these dozen individuals. There was nothing remotely amusing about them. On the contrary, there was something immensely frightening about them all. Arta, the commander of Shadow's honor guard, gathered his soldiers and there seemed to be some witty observation made, probably at the expense of us humans. Then I realized that none of the soldiers were carrying any equipment or devices I'd seen earlier. How the hell had it all disappeared? Of course, who said that these guys and probably ladies were from this neighborhood? Maybe they'd just opened a hole in space and nudged the cylinders through. If in Einsteinian theory a body could make space-time bend around it in 3 dimensions, then why not have a cupboard between spaces? I nearly missed seeing them move out of the square as the mysterious light faded. They all trotted up the road that would take them past the old rectory, although I didn't think they'd be going all that far. It looked as if they'd already forgotten this job and might even be talking about snooker and when they'd next get a pint. There were so many things going on in this world about which neither I nor any other human knew about. I probably wouldn't even understand the simplest explanation. Anyway, I didn't think that the fragile human ego could cope with the fact that they were regarded as insignificant in a much grander scheme. The island was simply a hopping off point and had little significance beyond that. Shadow looked up from his usual spot on the sofa when I got in. "Thanks for the help," I said. I leaned against the sofa and shook my head at the impossibility of what I'd experienced. Everyone had been so calm. The new impossible I'd seen had been someone else's familiar. Rationally, none of it made any sense, but there again, what did? It was another scenario to reenact in the care home, should that ever happen. Anyway. Something like that. All too much, really. I pushed off the sofa and headed for the bread bin and the bottle of wine in there. I shuddered as Evil Reg's head exploded again. "You look a bit better," I said to Shadow. "I hope you'll be okay tonight because I need an anesthetic. I don't think I'm ever going to sleep again." I still have an image of Evil Reg's brain sliding down a mirror. I think he nodded. He looked all right and his eyes were no longer sunken. He did look much better than before, which probably augured very badly for me.